Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here again. As you know, we're here visiting our grandson, Carter, and we've had a chance to visit with Taylor and Christy a bit, too. And we've got Carter, who had a wonderful Christmas. We all had a lot of fun. I have spent more time on the floor in the last 3 weeks, because he came and stayed with us for a while. Have spent more time on the floor in the last 3 weeks than I have in some time. So I've got muscles and joints that are sore in all the new places. So that's been the fun of a 2.5-year-old. And we have Jackson Riley arriving in May. Now, my due date is May 9th. That's the due date for Jackson. My daughter tells me it's really before that, but that's my birthday, so I'm thinking that we're going for May 9th. But I'm sure Jackson will have something to say about that, and we'll have to wait and see kind of how that goes. If you're visiting with us, I am not the regular guy. Mark and Karen, as most of you know, are away. They've had a very difficult season, losing both of their mothers in a short time, and I think they're away dealing with some family business. Mark called and Taylor called and asked if I'd be willing to fill in today and share some thoughts. I love this season. It's a great holiday season. But I'm always reminded when we all get together that whenever a group of people get together, we're all on different journeys. We're all at different places. And depending on where you are, you may be in a really good place. You may be in a very difficult place, a very tough, trying time. It's hard to know. I've called the lesson today, I've called it the call of the Christmas story. Or, if you will, and then intentional living in a war-torn world. And so what I want to do is I want to share this morning, have a time just to share and reflect. I really encourage you to sit back, have a moment where you let all of the worldly cares kind of slide away, and just reflect on the Christmas story and reflect on the call of that story on our lives. Now, I'd like to share with you, however, not the regular Christmas story, but I'd like to share with you the other Christmas story found in Scripture. It's not Matthew's account or Luke's account. It's John's account of the Christmas story, the birth of Jesus. Now, it's not for the faint-hearted, however, and you won't find it in John's gospel. It's not there. It's over at the very end in Revelation, where John shares his Christmas story. It is a story of great importance, implications in both this world and the heavenly realms. And again, it's not for the faint-hearted, so I'm going to invite you to buckle up while I share that story with you. I'm going to take cuttings out of Revelation chapter 12, and I encourage you to just sit tight and reflect on the imagery of this story, John's Christmas story. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 horns on its heads. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This is Jesus. And her child was safely snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon's angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the earth helped the woman and protected her. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who is that, you ask? Those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. He's gone to wage war against you and me. That's John's Christmas story. Just a shade different, is it not, than a story that we often think about? The implications of the story run deep, do they not? From the very beginning of mankind's story, we see Satan on the scene, attacking, lying, distorting, all of which introduces pain and death into the course of our lives. Every life carries along with it the baggage of pain, suffering, and death. I don't know whether you found that to be true in your life or not. My own journey so far in my years, I know what that looks like. I've had seasons of pain and brokenness and loss. In a holiday season like this, in the Christmas time, there's some people that are probably for the first Christmas celebrating without a beloved family member who's gone on. And the emptiness is real. I'm sure Mark and Karen feel that intently this year, do they not? And someone here does too. I don't know who you are, but someone here is probably going through the same thing. The brokenness of health, the brokenness of relationship, the suffering and the pain, it's all a part of our culture. It's all a part of life that Satan has inflicted into our journey. In Western culture, we have a lot of church and Christian approaches to the gospel that says we should be healthy and wealthy, that God wants us peaceful, healthy, and wealthy with no trouble, no issues. And that's just not my experience. And not only that, it's not what Scripture says. In fact, Jesus told His disciples in John 16, in this world you will have trouble. It's part of our journey. It's part of what's there. It happened from the very beginning. Pain, suffering, and death are part from the moment that Satan created the deceptions and the lies that took Adam and Eve down. In Genesis 3:16 through 19, to Eve God declared, with pain you will give birth to children, and your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And to the man he said, cursed is the ground because of you, and through painful toil will you eat of the soil until you return to the ground, until you die. Pain and death, that's the experience that we have. Interestingly, even God experiences the pain and brokenness inflicted upon the earth in His creation. Genesis 6:5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord grieved that He had made man, and His heart was filled with pain. Even God. This broken world, the war that is occurring in the spiritual realm behind the curtain of time that shields us, but it's occurring in our life, and pain and suffering are a part of that. We live in a world that attempts to offer many answers to the problem of pain and suffering, to cover it with the salve of drugs and alcohol, or maybe material possessions or money. Maybe we just detach, we run away, we fail to engage because to love and to care and to have a relationship is just too painful. And so we run away from it. But we deal with pain and suffering. God engaged in the pain of His heart. in the brokenness of the battle with the dragon. But we're God's people. There's a call in the Christmas story. There's a call to you and me. And the question is, how do we respond to this call of the Christmas story? How do we respond to the brokenness and the reality of life in this world? Kind of what is your answer to that? How do you respond to it? Maybe you're so overwhelmed you don't have an answer. Maybe you're in a season of pain and suffering and attack from the evil one that you're not sure how to respond. Well, how did God respond? He wanted to destroy everything. How did God respond to this? Well, obviously the birth of Jesus set the answer in motion, did it not? I want to take a minute in our time and share two stories with you that highlight, I think, God's answer to the dilemma of our life, and another that reflects in part our calling and how shall we then live in the midst of a war-torn world. So two thoughts. Monty and Beth Cox are good friends of ours. I've shared stories that Monty shared with me from here before. So you may remember that or be familiar. Monty is the Dean of Bible at Harding University. He and Beth spent 10 years in Kenya as missionaries before coming back, and he's been on the faculty at Harding for that time. Good friends, and we actually had Monty come to Houston, West Houston, several years ago while we were still here. We raised the family in Houston and spent 13 years with the West Houston Church up in Copperfield. And he was there one weekend and spent some time with us, and we had lunch, and then he was getting on a plane. He had to get back to Searcy, and so he was flying on Southwest to Dallas, changing planes, going on to Searcy after that. And so we put him on a plane, and he left. And while in the waiting area at Southwest in Dallas, he was waiting to get on, actually anxious about getting on in a hurry and wanting to get home. And he was looking kind of at the front of a line, and there was this woman there with a baby and a stroller, but the baby obviously was not right. Badly misshapen head. Something was wrong. He didn't know, but he just noticed her. Well, when they started boarding, she boarded first. He happened to be late in the B group, if you've ever flown on Southwest, which usually means back of the plane or middle seats at best, right, if you're in the late B group. Plane was full, kind of even leaving Dallas, and so he's thinking, I don't know where I'm going to be. I've got to get off that plane in a hurry. And so he gets on the plane, and there, the only seat at the front of the plane was a seat right next to this woman and her baby. And he decided, I'll sit down there. She's like, some people don't like to sit with a baby. You're not, no, I love babies. He said, I'll be happy. And so, in Monty fashion, he sits down and meets Kathleen and little CJ. Obviously, something was wrong with CJ. His head looked like a deflated basketball. His eyes were in the wrong place, and his nose did not line up right. He seemed awake, but there was kind of a blank stare that Monty really wouldn't understand until later. Well, as the conversation began, he found out a little bit about Kathleen. She was an educated woman. She was a doctor of audiology. She was on her way back home to St. Louis. They were actually flying to Little Rock, let Monty off, and then they were going to go on to St. Louis. That was the plan. So she was on her way to St. Louis to be back with her family. Had two sets of grandparents in Fort Worth that she'd been visiting, and so she was flying back. CJ was just sitting there, lifeless. Monty said, CJ certainly is a good traveler. Does he travel often? No, she said, this is his first and last flight. Well, that sounded bad. She went on to explain that little CJ had hydrocephalus, or water on the brain, as he decided. And when he was born, they'd put a shunt in his head to drain the fluid off of his brain, and learned that there was really nothing but fluid inside his skull, and the drain caused the skull to partially collapse. And there was just a little bit of brain tissue, as she described it, around the skull. just enough to keep him alive, but that was all. CJ had several major surgeries from the difficulties associated with this, even though he was just six months old. But they had decided no more of that, no more major interventions. She explained that CJ, he just sits there. When you hug him, he can't hug you back. When you smile and talk and play with him, there's no feedback. She wonders if anybody's even home. As they got acquainted further, Monty learned that Kathleen had been a Methodist growing up in her family, and her husband had been Catholic. And that was an issue this weekend with his parents, who wanted to sprinkle little CJ to save his soul. But Kathleen refused. When they got married, they had both said that they didn't believe that stuff, and they were not going to pretend even with their children. You see, she was going back to hospice with CJ. She would meet her husband and their other daughter and be with CJ, and they expected him to live for probably 2 or 3 months. Well, as the conversation unfolded, she began to ask a little bit about Monty and who he was, and so, as Monty describes it, that usually either starts or stops conversations when you find out who he is. And he often describes it a bit differently for someone that would not otherwise understand. So she asked him what he did. He says, well, I teach anthropology and religion at a Christian university. Oh, that's interesting, she said. Well, what sorts of religion do you teach? He says, well, I'm a Christian professor, but I teach Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism. Actually, he teaches a world religions class. I think my daughter took that class, if I'm not mistaken. It's well known on the campus. But he teaches that world religions class. Oh, Buddhism, Kathleen said. My husband and I have been interested in Buddhism. Oh, really? Monty said, what kind? Well, kinds? She didn't know there were kinds. Well, yeah, there's several factions. Well, Monty says, are you actually just exploring just a part of Buddhism, really? Well, yeah, we're really interested in Buddhist meditation. That's really what we're interested in. Oh, okay. So Monty says, Kathleen, is it possible to just take a piece out of a religion and practice that piece and leave behind the worldview that inspired that practice? Now, we're on a plane from Dallas to Little Rock, right? Kind of a heady question, but apparently she didn't seem to mind too bad. And so he said, well, how much do you know about kind of the roots of Buddhism? Well, she didn't know a whole lot. He said, well, you know about the 4 noble truths of Buddhism? He said, no, she didn't know that. So he explained, well, first noble truth, number 1, suffering happens. That seems consistent. We know pain and suffering. Suffering happens. Noble truth number 2, suffering is a product of cravings that go unfulfilled. If you have something and you lose it, you suffer. Number 3 is to extinguish or to eliminate suffering. If you want to eliminate suffering, you have to extinguish your cravings. You have to be detached. You have to detach yourself from your cravings. And the 4th is how to do that. There's an 8-fold path, and he began to explain that. Now, at this point, Taylor's thinking, Kerry, why are you talking about Buddhism in this Christian church? So you'll see in a second. We'll kind of come back around in just a minute. So he says, well, do you know about karma in Buddhism? Well, she knew about that. It's that whole merit-demerit thing. If you do really good things, you get kind of pluses in your merit bank. And when you die, there's a balance there. And if it's a good balance, when you're reincarnated and you come back in a new life, you come back as a better person, a more powerful person. Or if you've done really bad things, you come back as a broken, run-down, poor, just some kind of lowly person, or even maybe physically broken and broken down if you've done really bad things. The law of karma in Buddhism. It's kind of the link between your deeds and the consequences. So Monty asks Kathleen on this plane ride, Kathleen, if Buddha were sitting here what would he tell you about why CJ is the way he is? He'd probably say something about, karma. CJ did something bad in a previous life or lives and earned this broken body. Monty says, do you believe that? She says, no. I said, I don't believe that either, he said. That's good. He said, Kathleen, if Buddha were sitting here, what would he say to comfort you in your pain? He'd probably say something like detach. Detach from this child that can't even hug you back. Well, how's it going? Oh, we tried that, she said. And that's when she first started to cry. We tried that, but I just couldn't. I just couldn't. Monty said, Kathleen, you may not agree with this point of view, but I believe the reason you can't detach from your passion for CJ is because you were made in the image of a God who loves you unconditionally, even when you can't love him back or reach out to him. Monty, between Houston and Dallas, had been reading a book called The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. Some of you probably read it. It's a great book. It's A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, A Case for Faith. And he had literally just been reading a chapter about a missionary to Thailand, a Buddhist country, who was reflecting on the key symbol of the Buddhist faith in Thailand. It's this little bitty statue, chubby little Buddha, sitting in the lotus position with his arms out and his eyes half closed, blissfully detached. And then he thought, what is the symbol, the primary symbol of the Christian faith? It's Christ on a cross, attached, participating in our pain and suffering. He says, Kathleen, if Jesus was here, honestly, I do not know what he'd say about why CJ is the way he is. But one thing I know, when you started to cry, he would cry too. Because he participates in your pain. The call of God to answer the question of pain and suffering is to lean in, to participate in it. In the Hebrew writer in chapter 2, verse 9, speaking to a group of Jewish Christians who have been under terrible persecution, talks about God's response to the fallen world and mankind's enslavement to suffering and death. But we see Jesus, he says, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Now, that word taste is an important word. It is not taste like you would taste the chili to see if it's seasoned properly. Okay? It's not taste when my wife says, can I taste your dessert? And she wants a bite. It's not that kind of taste. The word taste here means fully participate in, literally translated. Jesus doesn't detach. He fully participates in death. He consumed death for you and me. In Genesis 6, God in his own pain had wanted to destroy everything, but his grace found favor with Noah, and God chose instead to send his Son who would fully participate in our death on our behalf. That's God's response. How do we respond to the call of the Christmas story? Well, there's many ways really, but I want to draw our attention just to one thought, and that is in John 13, Jesus offers this word one of his last calls to the disciples. He washes their feet and he says, listen, a new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. There's something about the testimony to the world. Our call to testify to the world is inextricably linked to our loving one another. Let me kind of give you an example of how I saw that play out one time. Carla and I, when we lived here before, sang with a group called the American Spirit Singers. And it was a group, it was very complex and fun, 16-part a cappella harmony. We did a lot of Americana music, some patriotic tunes. We'd sung the national anthem at the Astros game and that kind of thing. And we'd sing every Christmas. We decked out in full Dickens regalia, Elizabethan kind of big hoop skirts and tails and top hats. And we sang down at Dickens on the Strand back when they were having that, if you remember that, in Galveston, that kind of thing. And we'd sing at corporate parties and all those kind of things. But all of that was a highlight moving towards how we closed our season, Christmas season every year. And that was, we went down to M.D. Anderson and we sang all day on 10 floors of M.D. Anderson. It's a hard day. It's a blessed day. It's an emotionally wrenching day in many ways, many days. Carla and several of the ladies knitted chemo caps, and we'd take those chemo caps and hand those out, those little soft caps for the bald heads that needed to be warm. And we were singing on a floor, and one of the nurses said, hey, listen, knew who we were and knew that most of us kind of came out of a Church of Christ on the northwest part of town, and there was a Church of Christ preacher from Midland that was up on another floor, and they said, just got very grave news about his prognosis. Can you please go and see him? And we were making our way there. So we got to that floor and we made our way to that room, and we kind of piled into a little hospital room, 15 people, 8 women in big hoop skirts. It was quite a fit to kind of make sure skirts weren't flying up. We got in there. But we got in, we sang a few songs, sang a few hymns. He was really appreciative. His wife had gone to, I think, make some calls. He says, can y'all come back when my wife is here? Sure, we'll come back. And so after a little bit, we came back. His wife was there, and we all piled back into that room. We piled in. We circled up, and they grabbed our hands, and we grabbed their hands, and we circled, and we grabbed each other's hand. We sang, the Lord bless you and keep you. They clung to each other. Tears rolled down their face. Most of us, tears rolling down our face. Arm in arm, singing, participating with them in their pain. But as we finished, he wiped away the tears and he talked of the singing in heaven and the joy ahead and the hope we all share. He was encouraging us despite his circumstance. He then told us about one of the nurses who had come in, was taking care of him, had come in after we left the first time and asked, who are you? Because he'd never seen anything like that before. She'd never heard the music like that. It hadn't been her experience. She wasn't a Christian. He said, well, I'm a Christian. And all those people are fellow Christians with me. And it gave him an opportunity to share the gospel with her on his deathbed. Love one another, Jesus said. By this will all mankind know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Back on that plane, as it landed in Little Rock, Monty stood up and was waiting to rush off the plane when the doors opened. Kathleen and CJ remained there. They were going on to St. Louis. And he handed Kathleen that book, A Case for Faith. Put his name and his email address. She said she'd read it. He said, Kathleen, you likely think a relatively nice but somewhat nosy man sat here today. But from my perspective, God saved that seat for me because he wanted to tell you something today. He grabbed his stuff. He walked off the plane. He tells me he's prayed for Kathleen frequently. Hadn't heard from her. Doesn't know what happened when that seed was planted. But for Monty, his answer to the call was to be aware and to use every moment that comes his way to realize that kingdom purposes are at stake. And he used that plane ride to do that. Brothers and sisters, as I close, we are players in a greater purpose. God wants to use us to engage in the greater cause of the Christmas story. In Ephesians 6, Paul says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." My brother posted an essay on Facebook that he called "When Christmas Was an Act of War." And if you'll allow me to read just a piece, quote, "Christmas brought peace on earth in a similar sense that the invasion of Normandy brought peace to Europe. The stable in Bethlehem was not in itself a peaceful event, but an act of war, long prepared for the final stages of God's campaign to eliminate evil. The manger in Bethlehem was an arrow aimed at the very heart of darkness." Brothers and sisters, the die is cast, the mortal wound inflicted on evil, but we are called to be witnesses for the cause of peace on earth. And to, as Paul says, take our stand against the devil's schemes. We need to live our lives perpetually aware of the spiritual reality we are part of. The call of the Christmas story is a call to intentional living in a war-torn world. The dragon intends to distort, lie, and plant despair in the hearts of mankind. And our message is of grace and truth and hope and love. I pray that we have the courage to express these in increasing measure in 2014 to one another and to the people who intersect our lives. May God use us for His purposes in the kingdom. Brothers and sisters, Jesus, the light of the world, came here into darkness. How will you respond?